In my video about House of Ashes theories, I showed some Sumerian writing that was featured in the promotional images, hoping that someone would be able to offer some help in translating them. Some talented viewers stepped up to help out, and now I can offer you a possible translation of the text. I say possible because, as my translators explained, Sumerian is far from definitively understood. Starting off, we have this indistinct squiggle, which is a recreation of this tablet, which reads, Naram Sin built this temple of Inanna, Inanna being the Akkadian goddess more commonly known as Ishtar. The version that Supermassive is created for their ad reads, Naram Sin built this temple of Sin. Kind of odd to build a temple to yourself, but maybe Supermassive wants to focus on how creepy the Temple of Sin sounds. Notably, Sin is also the name of a moon god, and Ishtar is the daughter of Sin. If it was a temple to himself, though, this kind of self-congratulation wouldn't be that unusual. Naram Sin was the grandson of Sargon of Akkad, and he was responsible for the expansion of the Akkadian Empire to its greatest strength and size. He even crowned himself God of the Known World. Next up we have the names of two places. The top one is Babylon, the bottom is Gutum, the land of the Gutians. This might not be completely random, as Naram Sin fought Gutians during his reign. Maybe Supermassive is mixing up the history a little, and the defeat of the Gutians will be relevant to the game's plot. The stele featured in the promotional material is about his defeat of the Lulubi people, who lived in the Zagros Mountains where the game is set. But since the Gutians also lived in those mountains, perhaps things are being fudged a little. My translator also wanted to make sure we mention that the reference to Babylon seems strange, because Babylon would not be founded until 300 years after the death of Naram Sin. Here we can see the symbols for freedom, which is a disputed translation, by the way, prayer, and of course, An, the sky god, which is the only symbol I was able to correctly interpret on my own. On this page, in addition to seeing the same images from the previous pictures, we have this symbol 5 times. It can be translated as paste, phlegm, mucus, sputum, foam, scum, spittle, or poison. So lots of spitting imagery there, and also the word poison. Something we'll have to look for in the game? Subterranean monsters with toxic spittle? Certainly a possibility. That's it for the translations, but my translator was kind enough to offer some of their knowledge about how ancient Assyrian history might factor into the game's backstory. The Zagros Mountains, where the game is set, are believed to be the entrance to the underworld, and so could feature the underground city of Kutha, where Nergal and Ereshkigal, the king and queen of the underworld, ruled. So yeah, it turns out the idea that the statue of Pazuzu might be there to warn people about the entrance to the underworld being nearby might not be so far-fetched after all. Oh, and one final note from my helpful researcher. The Mesopotamian underworld was never called the House of Ashes. It actually has a few names, such as Kur, Kigal, or Kurnugia, which means land from which there is no return, and I definitely pronounced that wrong. The House of Ashes thing is a description of what the place is, although apparently that's a knowingly inaccurate translation made to sound creepy, when in fact Kur was described as a house of dust. The line comes from a myth about Ishtar's descent into the underworld. Here's the key lines from the myth. The daughter of Sin was determined to go to the dark house, dwelling of the Irkala gods, to the house those who enter cannot leave, on the road where traveling is one way only. To the house where those who enter are deprived of light, where dust is their food, clay their bread. They see no light, they dwell in darkness, they're clothed like birds with feathers. Over the door and the bolt, dust has settled. Lots of interesting stuff here. Not only the references to bird-themed revenants, and the confirmation that dust is a better translation than ashes, but even more intriguing, given the game's premise, is this section. I will smash open the doorposts, I will force the doors, I will bring up the dead to eat the living, and the dead will outnumber the living. So will the game's story mirror Ishtar's descent? A woman going into the underworld seems to be the main plot of the game, and the threat of all of the monsters that live there escaping is one hell of an image, so that could definitely be an interesting place for it to go. All fascinating stuff. Does it tell us what the game is going to be about, though? If we assume that this was all selected knowingly, then maybe the sequence with the archaeologists will start with them excavating a temple to the god King Naram Sin built on the site of his defeat of the people of the Zagros Mountains, only to have them uncover an entrance to a subterranean kingdom full of monsters. Perhaps even the devolved descendants of the people Naram Sin fought and drove underground? We'll find out the truth soon enough, but for now I'd like to once again thank my translators Arik and Apin, Polish students of Assyriology, for their incredibly helpful work. Hopefully they'll be willing to offer their thoughts on the game's take on Akkadian mythology when we know a little more about it. Also, I'd like to thank my patrons Marissa and Desire for helping make videos like this possible. I'll see you back here for the next thing, but until then, au revoir.